Hey, welcome everybody to the second in the three-part series of how do you retain employees? And I'm here again with my expert HR consultant, Christi Green, and we're going to talk about what we did last week. And Christi, I don't know if you want to sort of step in here and give some background on what did we talk about last week?
Last week, what we wanted to do was sort of kick it off with making sure that people understand that it's super important to engage people from the minute they look at that advertisement right up to the point where you have a call with their recruiter and then onboard them into the organization that they're joining, making sure that the vision, the mission, the values are really abundantly clear and the expectations for them in that role are also abundantly clear so they know what they're expected to do right as they walk through that door.
Yeah. And I think it's something we don't often think about as part of retention, that it happens actually during recruitment, right? Retention and recruitment. And I think the other thing that was interesting that we sort of discussed last week was looking at terms of what could we do for the employee right out of the gate as part of that orientation program, where we give them some tools to be able to maybe help understand how do you communicate effectively within this organization, maybe how do you build resilience. And it was funny, I was thinking afterwards, and something that I'm going to be doing with one of my clients is looking at doing a DISC assessment for new hires right out of the gate, right? And if you think about that, it gives them an opportunity to understand their personality right when they start a new organization.
I love that idea because it helps them understand that the first day they walk through the door, this organization cares about how I not only walk through the door, but it cares about how I ultimately carry out the job I do every day, and then how I interact with my colleagues.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah,
gives
totally.
me the opportunity to say, oh, okay, how do I now interact from my perspective with this organization as these expectations grow and I feel engaged and welcomed into the company.
Yeah. And I really can imagine that somebody leaves their first day of work and hopefully in their, they go home and they talk to whoever is there about, right, this unique thing that happened at this place of work where they learned something about their own personality in terms of how they show up, and they maybe had never thought about that before. So, um, but now we're into, right, the person's on board. What do we do now? And I think this is what people most think about when they think of retention. What do we do when employees now are part of the organization? And we had a conversation prior to this, and you talked about the importance of the manager's role within the first 90 days, what they should be doing. I wonder if you could talk about that first.
So I think it's going to be really important for those managers on that first day to be that part of that welcoming for that new employee, because it makes sure that they've seen each other, especially in this virtual world now or hybrid world. It's possible that those employees have only done an interview on Zoom potentially, right?
Yeah.
Particularly sometimes in the healthcare space. So making sure that there's a face that welcomes them there, particularly their manager, and then that manager checks in on a regular basis, right? Not just on day one, but on day 5. At the end of the week, it's just as important as the end of the day on day 1. And then ultimately, over those next few weeks, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days are the most important places for that interaction to occur, when they have the ability to either correct something that they don't think is aligned with the expectations of the job description, or something that's not aligned with the values of the organization, right? Not every person is going to be a fit for every organization. It's an opportunity to have that conversation, communicate openly about that, and reset the expectation so that everybody's on the same page moving forward.
Yeah, which I think goes back to that first part of onboarding that we talked about in terms of providing maybe some skill set in terms of how do you communicate, right? If things aren't going well, what's an appropriate way or an effective way that you might be able to voice concerns going forward? I think you're right on there. When I think about that piece of the employee and the manager, the relationship, I think of the SCARF model we've talked about, and I think about relatedness. And I was wondering if you could maybe just sort of say, what are your thoughts on that when we talk about the importance of relatedness for an employee to feel that?
They have to understand that relationship between why they're there, which is just not for a paycheck, right? And maybe it is just for a paycheck. So to be fair, there might be people out there who just need a job, which is
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
right? As long as, from a relatedness perspective, they can connect the dots between the paycheck I'm going to get every week or every other week to the job I'm doing every day. And that relatedness comes back to almost like head and heart, right? Am I feeling like this is an organization I want to belong to? Is this an organization that I feel like I can relate to and go home at the end of the day, to your point, and say to my family or my friends, hey, this organization really gets it. They are helping me connect those dots between what our organizational goal is and why I'm here and how I can help move that forward.
Yeah. And for those of you listening that might be wondering, well, where does relatedness come from? It's a model that I'll just quickly give an overview on. It's called SCARF. It was developed back in, I think, like 2008 by a neuroscientist, Dr. David Rock, and it's about 5 social needs that we all have, and that in many ways these 5 social needs, in terms of whether they're satisfied or not satisfied, impact the same part of our brain in terms of survival that we see for even things like food and water. I mean, these are basic social needs we have. So the first one in SCARF is around status. And that's about people feeling as though they're valued. There's a sense of worth that they experience in terms of the people that they interact with around. The next one is around certainty, is about understanding what are the rules of the road. Do I know how to navigate the organization that I'm in this sense, or what the timeline might be for maybe development for me here. And then the next one is around autonomy. It's providing a sense of social need where employees, even though they come on board, they feel as though they've got some control over their destiny, on where they might be able to go. And then relatedness, which Christi just hit on, is also about feeling as though you fit within the organization, that you're part of the in-group. And I don't mean that from positive or a popularity standpoint, but just that you're part of the organization. And then the last one is around fairness, is that we all sense the need for justice or fair treatment. So some employees can't get treated better than others or allowed to follow different rules, and how all of those social needs come in. So,
and I think that whole model put together it's exactly about how we bring a person into an organization, into the company, and making sure that we understand from our perspective that it's a nerve-wracking to start a new job. And people don't know the organization. They might not even know anybody there, right? But hopefully, as an organization begins to utilize these tips and tricks and embraces bringing new folks into the organization, the people who are there realize I also have a huge part to play in this, and begin to realize that welcoming of that new employee is as much about them, who's been here for maybe, whether it's 2 months or 20 years, that part is just as important for them.
yeah, totally. And you know what I think about, Christi, when we talk about the SCARF, is that each one of those things, right? Think about the employee that you talk about from day one, or the relationship they have with a manager, and how they're brought on board. There's a sense of status that they feel there, right? That they feel valued, that they're respected. Like, wow, isn't that great? This is what happened to me just in the beginning of working for this organization. Or certainty, that I think the more they understand about the onboarding process, about how the organization works, and what's expected of them, right? We hit on certainty, right? And maybe asking them their opinion about things, and how they'd like to do things, right, hits on autonomy. And then we talked about relatedness. And I think lastly, fairness is, I think fairness speaks for itself. So
I think that's true. And the fairness also is going to come through in the conversations, the
yeah,
communication of what are my expectations? And am I then going to be treated the same as everybody else coming into the organization and everybody else that's already here? So there's no, for example, specialized treatment because the manager likes someone better than another, right?
yeah.
There's no bias one way or another.
So it's interesting. So we talk about SCARF, and then, but to me, I think the other thing here around cables plays into what you just talked about at fairness. With that first behavior in that cables model is around congruence or alignment, right? If somebody doesn't feel as though things are fair, it probably oftentimes relates to not walking the talk, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if we sort of keep moving on the cables model, right? This now to me is about how do we help managers understand some of the behaviors that will positively impact retaining employees or putting them in the right place. The next one we talk about is appreciation, recognition. How important is that?
To make sure that everybody feels, again, it comes to the belonging, right? If I'm appreciated, I know that I'm going to be able to belong to this organization. I was at a sales meeting for a company I'm consulting with yesterday, and the entire first almost 20 minutes of this meeting was recognition and appreciation for an incredible year of 2022, right? They met their sales marks, they exceeded their sales marks. They acknowledged each other in what went well over the last week, last month, and the last year. And I was really impressed with the engagement in the room because people spoke up. People acknowledged each other and also acknowledged themselves, which in an
Interesting. Yeah.
organization where you don't have congruence or overall appreciation, you don't have people who are able to raise their hand and say, here's what I did last week that went well. And then share how did I get there? Right? I got there because I did these other things in preparation to be successful.
Yeah, I think when you talk about that, I think of psychological safety, that you create an environment where people feel as though they can be more open about what's going on, both positive and I think negatively or where there are challenges. I also think of appreciation. We hear so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion right now, and appreciation or recognizing people for what they do also involves recognizing people for who they are. And I think that's an important part for employees to feel, again, a sense of belonging, but to be respected or recognized for their backgrounds, the things that they come to the organization with. So it plays into that.
I think that's true. And, ultimately making sure that everyone, again, has that voice, to your point,
Yeah.
and shares their knowledge, right? Because, again, that was something that was talked about yesterday. Hey, if you've learned something new today, tomorrow, last week, and by the way, that learning can be a negative, right? That learning can be, oh, I don't think I want to do that again, right? It can be an opportunity for you to say to someone else, you're doing this in another territory. Don't do what I just did
Yeah.
because it didn't work,
Yeah.
right? So again, communication, openness about congruence across, in this case, regions. How do we align what we're doing in varying areas so that we learn from each other in the positives and the negatives?
Yeah. So as we're going through this too, I'm thinking it back to the social needs, right? So congruence or alignment, I think, can hit on a number of those social needs. I think of certainty, right? If our organization says these are our values, this is our mission statement, and the manager and the people around them are walking the talk, are in alignment with what those values are, it creates a sense of certainty, right? An employee knows, like, okay, this organization means what they say, right? I think that's important. Belongingness, right, is the next cable that we talk about, and we kind of hit on that right from the very beginning around relatedness, right? Relatedness and creating belongingness are very similar. But then when we move on, right, the next cable's sort of cable is around listening. And how important is that in regards to a manager being able to develop that skill?
I think it's one of the most important things that any manager can do because, it's the old saying that you have two ears and one mouth, right?
Yeah.
So listen twice, speak once. So making sure that you have one-on-one time. It's not just walk by and, hey, how are you? And you're going to be able to do that, right? You're doing walking. If you're doing a walk around, you might not have any time, and that employee might not have a lot of time to talk to you either. But it's visibility, right? And it might be an opportunity for them to say, hey, can I catch you for a minute? Can I ask you a quick question? That visibility now became important because they know you're available to them,
Yeah.
you're listening to them, And then you have one-on-one time where you sit down and you try and tease through, what are they actually saying? Making sure you're asking open-ended questions, not just, is everything going okay? Yeah. Right. Tell me how things are going.
Right.
Tell me how your first day was. Tell me how your first month has been. What could we do to improve the next person that's coming along first month? Okay. Now, what do you want? Here's the job description. Here's what you've done the last 30 days. What do you want to do in the next 30 days? Right? Actually listening to that person and engaging and inviting that person to participate in a conversation. There are a lot of organizations that weren't doing this before the pandemic. The pandemic has certainly taxed managers and leaders' ability to be able to have that one-on-one time. And I'm really hopeful that we can get back to that.
Yeah. I think anytime that we can get creative too on the questions, right? I mean, some that I was thinking about too around the lines of maybe what have you experienced that you weren't expecting since you've come on board, right? So we start to understand, like, what are some of the gaps maybe that we still have to make sure that we try and address as part of our onboarding, right? How does what you're experiencing and what you thought you were going to do, how closely are they lined up? Along those lines, again, I immediately think of listening, and I go back to those social needs, right? That when we're listening, right, we elevate somebody's status because they feel valued, that we take the time to listen to them or ask questions that are relevant to them, to their well-being, right? From a standpoint of certainty, I think we hit on that one too with individuals. Autonomy, especially if we're asking their opinions on things, right?
Yes.
That provides they have a voice. Relatedness, I think, right? You feel included, and then I think fairness too can come in there as well.
Yeah, I have this vivid memory when you just said that, of an organization. We did an employee survey, and it was a healthcare organization, and the results were, in this case, surprising to leaders, which was unfortunate, and it gave us an opportunity to correct it going forward. The result was that nurses at the bedside said leaders are making decisions about how we do our work every day without asking us about how we do our work every day.
Yeah.
So you're not listening, right? It was an opportunity for us as an organization to then move into a creation of a decision-making structure, right? And identify what's a command and control kind of decision, what's a consultative kind of decision, and what's a decision where, oh, well, whatever you want is fine. Here are your guardrails, though, right? Your guardrails for a new uniform in security is that you can choose blue, black, or brown. We don't care what you decide, but it's up to you, right? Versus the command and control decision or a consultative decision where we want your input. We get to listen to you in that consulting structure where we say, oh, okay, well, how does what we just rolled out from a policy perspective affect the work you do every day?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, just in that story, my mind goes back to Scarf, and I think every one of those things was impacted, right? The level of status is lowered when you're just being told this is what's going to happen to you next. You don't have a sense of certainty, right? Because you're like, what's going to come next? What's senior leadership going to put on our plate next? There's no autonomy, right? Because we have no voice in what's going on.
Right.
You certainly don't feel as though you're part of the relatedness, and there's a lack of fairness, right? You're being told what you should do by people that really don't understand what the demands of your job are, what you need.
And you're ultimately being rated on it because you're having a performance evaluation, right? Based on things that you were told to do that you don't agree with.
Yeah. So moving on, the next one in cables I think is really important too, right? Is this behavior of empathy that managers develop, right, as part of cables. And where do you think that fits as it relates to onboarding? How important is that? I mean, there are some things that I think about with new employees, but
With new employees, I think as we bring them on board, making sure we understand where they're coming from, right? It is so all of the cables are related. It's the point of your structure, for example, of the Golden Gate Bridge, right? You can't have one without the other, and in order to have empathy, you've got to listen and then be able to say to that person, I hear you. And I've been new in an organization as well. I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Right. And how do I help you and support you to be successful here?
Yeah. And I think that's so key, right? As part of that empathy is that we really need to imagine what it was like or what it would be like if you were the new person. How would you want to be treated? Right? What would you want the process to look like? Or maybe you went through a bad experience and you think back to that and you're like, I don't want to put somebody else through that.
Right.
So the last one that we move on to, and again, I think again it hits back on many of those social needs, is around specifics, right? It's about making sure that we set clear expectations
Yes.
for employees. How important is that for a new employee to have clear understanding of what's next?
Again, if I don't know what I'm expected to do, how can I do my job well? So I think if you're clear with me about when I come through the door, I know, first of all, where I'm going on day one and where I'm going on day two, because likely those two things are different, right? If I'm coming to a sort of a general orientation, I'm probably going to a conference center. But day two, I'm showing up in my department, maybe in another building, maybe on another campus, right? Making sure I understand that makes me feel like I'm going to be, it's a comfort zone for me. And that specificity means, oh, I hope that specificity is going to continue on throughout my journey with this organization so that I can become successful. Asking that person specifically, what is it you want to achieve while you're here? What is it that you want to attain while you're here? Setting clear goals with that person to say, okay, well, I came in the door as a driver for an organization, but I don't want to be out driving in the snow, for example, today in the Northeast, right? I want to ultimately be behind that counter, welcoming people into this organization. So how do I get from this driver position up to that counter position in that customer service focused space? Here are the specifics that I believe you can do it, and here's how quickly I believe you can achieve that.
Yeah. And when we talked about this in the first part of the series around providing employees on orientation with some skill sets, I think this is where it can be invaluable for the employee to maybe help them develop some skills in terms of how do they ask questions to make sure that they are clear in terms of what they're supposed to be doing. That if there's any ambiguity that they're feeling, that we have empowered them with a sense of, here's how you make sure you need to clarify as well. So it comes from both ends, right? Manager clarifies with the employee to say, maybe do you understand what I'm asking you to do or what the process is here? But the employee all has the confidence, hopefully at this point, to say, I'm not really sure what you're asking. Could you maybe rephrase that? So it goes both ways.
Well, and that comes back to the empathy, right? Making sure that we're listening. If that person's not asking any questions, as a manager or a leader, I'm hoping that I'm keyed in enough to that to be able to say,
it's great.
There's some quietness here. Do they really know what they need to do? Or do I need to just have a quick 5-minute? Is everything okay? Right? It's acknowledging, that's paying attention. It's the empathy and really gets to that specificity of listening.
Yeah. So obviously this second part of this series around retention and how do we do it has been a little longer, right? Because this is really the meat of when you have somebody on board. This is like 90 days and until the person leaves. Well, these are things that we're doing ongoing with this employee. We're in the last phase of this that we're going to do for next week. I think we're going to talk about another one of those unique areas that you sort of identified that to me is similar to the onboarding starts with recruitment. Now we're going to talk about it that retention is also can be improved based on offboarding.
And offboarding is a term,
next.
Offboarding is a term that I think a lot of people don't either know or pay attention to.
Yeah.
And that is, how do we say farewell to an employee who's chosen to leave our organization, or in fact, maybe who hasn't chosen, that we have chosen to eliminate, right? In one way or another. So, if I've decided that this isn't the organization for me at this time in my life, maybe that's not because I don't like the organization. Maybe it's because I have a spouse that's in the military and he or she is being deployed and I need to change what I'm doing.
Right.
I need to adapt to to my home life and my family life, right?
Right.
And we manage that here in the seacoast of New Hampshire because we're near, a base.
Yep.
So, or it's because I know there's not an opportunity at this organization for me to take a next step up in my career or over in my career.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave the organization to achieve that. I want to make sure I invite that person back in the right way. And that's what we're going to talk about next week.
Yeah, it's going to be good, right? Because I do think that's the final, it's like the bookends of it. We're going to talk,
Yes.
the onboarding is important, but also offboarding is something that there's a lot of value that we're going to be able to, I think, gain from how do we rework things to make sure that we retain those that are still around. So
Yes.
thanks again, Christy. This has been so valuable. Thanks all for all of you that have been listening to this. Obviously, it'll be up for anybody that wants to have another preview on it. And